Hello, everyone, music lovers all. This is Gregg Bendian. You're listening to the ProgCast. And if you listen to this show, you know that we like to go into some different areas of music and musical thought and have a lot of fun exploring the connections between different musical worlds. And I feel that today I have a kindred spirit in Brian Kane and his wide-ranging interests, all the way from jazz guitar to circuit bending and conceptual composition, which, if you watch this show, you know are very strong interests in your boy. So it's nice to have somebody that's into all this stuff. His connection with Pierre Schaeffer is very important, and his all of his thoughts on even people like Derek Bailey will be in here somewhere. So welcome, Brian Kane. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
So why are you into such strange music?
That's a great question. Uh music is wonderfully strange, you know? Music is just like is endlessly strange and endlessly interesting. And strange music is where it all happens. I think all the good music was strange music to begin with. Yeah. I
That's
mean,
it. We're done. Thank
that's
you.
it.
Good night.
We're done. I mean, I what else can you say about it? I mean, there's a strange music is unconventional music, right? And music is always, I don't know, music is about the kind of relationship of, of conventions and expression, you know, like working through conventions to find the unconventional, to kind of play with them and to push through it. I mean, music makes worlds, and you can play with those worlds. And so I think strange music does that in a totally fantastic way. I love living in a world of strange music. I've always been drawn to it.
Yeah.
Uh,
How old are you?
how old am I? I'm 49.
Oh, shoot. I'm 59. So the psychedelic music that I heard when I was 3 and 4, like Revolver,
Uh-huh.
that was it. It was all over for me.
Yeah, wow. That's great to hear that at age 3. Yeah, my earliest some of my earliest musical memories, um, yeah, it wasn't psychedelic music. I mean, I grew into that stuff. I loved it as
Well,
like a
just
teen, you
what's
know?
part of what you're exposed to as a kid. Yeah.
Yeah. But I remember being like, this is my earliest musical memory, if you want to hear this.
Yeah.
I remember I went to this uh there was a kindergarten. I think I was in an after school program in this kindergarten. You know, my folks both worked and stuff. So and what I remember about it, I hope this isn't just like a complete like crazy Freudian, you know, screen fantasy or something like that. I think this actually was the case. I remember there was like a guy who was like taking care of us in daycare, and they had a record player in this, and we used to listen to like the records I remember were like it was Queen, Blondie, Kiss. I remember like at age 5, we were like all into Kiss. We were making like Kiss masks
Yep.
as
Oh
5
yeah.
year olds, you know?
Oh
This would
yeah.
have been like 1978 or something like that, you know? Um, I kind of remember there being like a Pretenders record or something, but we used to listen to all this stuff like in kindergarten. I remember being sort of into it. And I remember some records felt really like dangerous, you know? I remember like the Pretenders seemed really tough when I was 5 years old, you know? Like,
You
yeah,
know
you don't
what's
mess around with
interesting
that
about
stuff.
this is you already showed an attraction to atmosphere
Yeah, I suppose. I
and
don't
the
know. I mean,
vibe and the sound, because
the,
that's obviously had to be produced to come across that way. You obviously could produce it badly, and that attitude wouldn't come across.
yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, so maybe I got to thank whoever this dude was that was taking care of us.
I mean, but all those things are also how you are have the sensitivity to deal with them.
Yeah,
So the fact that it hits you, like the fact that I have a 3-year-old memory in '66 of hearing "Tomorrow Never Knows."
yeah. Well,
I
that'll do
don't
it to you.
even know like if that's a pseudo religious thing at this point, and
Yeah,
finding guys like Steve Hackett that all were similarly affected by Tomorrow Never Knows, and it's the last track on Revolver, and he's chanting from the beginning at the end.
yeah, yeah. Do you ever see that Mad Men episode that ends with Tomorrow Never Knows? there's kind of a fantastic Mad Men episode, like where they're telling Don Draper to like check out this band called the Beatles, like something like this, and they give him a copy of Revolver, and the last scene is like him in his apartment or whatever, listening to Tomorrow Never Knows, and they must have paid a ton of money because they licensed the original recording, right? Because you needed that. It was not like you could
But if it was Tomorrow Never Knows, really somebody's experience of that,
yeah,
I'm so there.
it was great. It was kind of an amazing episode of that show where it was like, I mean, where they kind of got it, like it was a way of sort of describing a certain, I don't know. I didn't live through the 60s, but it seemed to capture a certain kind of a moment, because I mean, that's not Don Draper's scene.
But it happened to people, and I remember it, and I remember seeking it also as a visual thing where you would have the lights out with the headphones on.
Mhm.
You could up the ante.
Right.
You were that into it, and it meant that much to you. Tomorrow Never Knows would give you that.
Yeah. 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 I mean,
And
so much
so,
that stuff, so much that stuff is so the brilliance. I mean, one of the things that I'm always that I grew to be really interested in, is the studio in some sense, right? This is one of the things that links a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in. And the studio is the place where all of that atmosphere is really being designed and shaped and sculpted and worked on. It's the kind of the post-war rise of the studio, 1950s, the new sound or whatever, is just so absolutely crucial for our soundscape. It's what we live in, I mean, sometimes when I'm teaching like music appreciation or doing a basic course, I basically try to make the argument, that all music I tell this to students, I'm like, everything you hear is electronic music, right? All music essentially is electronic music once it's recorded.
that's true. Yeah.
Right? And it's all been kind of sculpted and tweaked and manipulated and worked on, not in a negative way, not in a kind of, not
It's
in
still the same chore set that you have that you had with tape. I mean, it's still, yeah.
But that's the world of sound that we live in nowadays. That's the world of music, is just like so much incredible detail and manipulation and shaping of all of these atmospheres, in order for us to kind of live in them. They're architectural, there's so much pop music that, I mean, I'm not a huge pop music person nowadays, I mean, I have a kid, so I hear a lot more of it, right? But there's stuff where it's just like the sculpting of sound is just amazing on it, totally remarkable.
I want to jump from that to the beginnings of electronic music with you because I know that you care about this very
Mhm.
much. And I want to ask you about a few pieces.
Yeah.
How important for you was Poème électronique?
uh it was pretty important, but not the most important. It
Gesang
was,
de Junglinge?
that was, yeah, hugely important for me. Yeah. Yeah. um
Come Out?
Not I feel like not so important.
I just, do the over under for me, Brian. Come on.
Okay. I mean, do you want to just toss out a list of pieces? I can. I mean, do you want reasons? I can give you reasons.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Okay. So Poème électronique, I had already kind of gotten. There was Varese was very important to me.
But he's later, I sense, in your
Yeah.
timeline.
Yeah, I got kind of more interested in some of the earlier stuff. So by the time Poème électronique comes out, that's kind of late in the game in some ways for some of the music concrete that I was most excited about. The Stockhausen electronic music, Gesang de Junglinge, especially Kontakte, that piece blows my mind. Those are incredible. They are incredible narratives, adventurous narratives. Oh, let me turn that off. Gutsy. They have these incredible shapes and drives to them, and these narratives, they flow, they unfurl, and so I love that aspect of electronic music, the kind of formal freedom sometimes that it has, the kind of ability for it to go in kind of all sorts of weird directions, partially because of the constraints of the material and partially because they're an attempt, I mean, it's dumb to make a sonata in electronic music, so I love that stuff. But Stockhausen is really, from that period I feel like there's, about like a decade of Stockhausen's work, really, maybe from like Zeitmasse, or maybe 15 years from like Zeitmasse all the way up through maybe Mantra or something, where that stuff is just incredible, like unbelievable. The kind of every piece is different, every piece is exploring something new, every piece is sonically kind of unique. The technique opens up in all kinds of ways, you know, goes from, you know, a piece like Zeitmasse, for me, I hear the something like the kind of rigid serial technique just suddenly opens up, and it becomes, once you get the various like time tracks that everyone can, you know, it's an incredibly, you know, fertile and creative period. I mean, the guy blows my mind for, you know, for 15 years, which is for a, you know, that's a really good run. You know, that's a really good run.
If you're not watching and you're listening, I'm smiling ear to ear because I've just recently fallen into a Stockhausen worship phase
Yeah.
again, and just sort of looking at things I hadn't looked at before, and just looking at the vast body of work and just going, how it is these combination of notes, he just made it interesting. It's like he's just so musical, he's just making everything interesting.
Yeah.
You give him like 2 sheets of paper and he'll make something happen. It's like, it's a force, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, I love the wacky legend stuff, and, you know, just everything about it. You just can't believe it's just how huge it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's moments where I start to kind of get off the bandwagon, you know, in the 70s and stuff, but there's just that period, that really fertile period all across the 1960s and late
But
50s.
did you check out the days of the week toward the end?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it's insane, you know. I mean, and you know, people make lots of critiques of Stockhausen for kind of stealing ideas from other people, you know.
Did
Like,
he?
you know, I mean, I don't know, you know, the theater pieces are probably heavily influenced by the what's that theater piece that he did in New York in the mid 60s, you know, heavily influenced by Fluxus and Cage, and you know, and his Austem Siebentaga, like, you know, taken, you know, it's like he's taking certain kinds of, you know, is he also working from the kind of Fluxus conceptual, you know, sound world? I don't know. Well, whatever he does, he figures out ways to make this stuff, to kind of put his own stamp and signature on it.
Interesting take.
I mean, he gets, you know, there's reasons to critique, you know, there's reasons to critique aspects of Stockhausen's work, but as a composer, just as a kind of compositional output, stuff's amazing. And I mean, and I really love the electronic music. In some ways, because I think he kind of, even though he's so sort of associated, I guess, you know, with the German, you know, electronic music school, with Elektronische Musik and you know, Cologne and all that, you know, and something like the synthesis ideal of electronic music as opposed to sample-based electronic music that you get from Schaeffer, that actually doesn't really hold when you actually look at what Stockhausen's up to, right? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, Gesangter Junglinge is a kind of mix of both, you know, synthesis and music concrete, right, with the singing and the voice
manipulation, right?
Yeah. You know, and there's a piece like, I feel like a piece like Kontakte, you know, which I guess could be thought of as more kind of on the kind of, you know, German electronic music side, is really also a kind of theatrical and ritual piece, right? Because when you see it done live, you know, it's got the performers that are going along with it. It's kind of formally set up like a ritual. A lot of
ritual plays into his stuff frequently, doesn't it?
Huge, yeah, it's huge. And I remember hearing like you know, going and actually sitting in a 4-channel performance of Kontakte, and that stuff is just incredible. It's like the way in which he's working with the spatialization of sound, you know, is just like brilliant. You know, he had that rotating speaker that he would like mixed it on, and so you're sitting in the middle of this kind of vortex of sound that is just rotating around you all the time. I mean, it's really amazing. And then I love a piece like Mikrofoni Eins, that piece, you know, where it's, you know, he's got the 4 players working on the tam and it's being sent off to 2 people mixing. That's, you know, that is the moment of live electronic music. That's the moment when we're not going to be doing, you know, tape pieces anymore. We can do all this stuff live. We can do it, you know, and it's also theatrical and it's also ritualistic, and so it's working on all these levels at the same time. But something like, I mean, Mikrofoni Eins, which is incredible if you ever see it performed, is kind of, is you know, transformative to be in this world where you're watching everything, you can see everything unfold in front of you, and yet sonically there's so much that is unknown and sort of mysterious about what's happening, right? I mean, it's like, it's one of these things where you understand the conditions and the setup, but yet the sounds that are being made are both coming off this instrument and coming out of the speakers, and then they meld in ways that are just unexpected. And so I love that kind of magic trick that he's able to do, you know, the thing of like of bringing you making all the conditions of possibility as clear as possible, and yet also giving you this kind of aesthetic experience, you know, that's on top of that.
Are you aware of one of his henchmen, Hugh Davies?
Yeah. Hmm. I don't
So,
know his music very well. I mean, I know the writing, right? Hasn't he written?
yeah, he's written about it. He was one of the guys working in the ensembles when he had the improv ensembles, and he was live electronics. And he worked with Derek Bailey in the free improvisation community as well, in the music improvisation company,
Okay.
different various companies. And uh, it was so fascinating to me that Derek Bailey, who I know you're a fan of,
Yeah.
he was so plugged into so many different scenes, but wanted freedom of expression through improvisation and no necessity of common language either.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's like a real time, you're talking about real time sound unfolding. This is a real time relationship conversation unfolding,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
And so he would have classical players like Ursula Oppens in the ensemble, you know, he would have completely untrained musicians performing that had a sound world.
Hmm.
And it became this, and it is this melding of sound worlds.
Yeah. Yeah. I gotta follow up on his musical output. I don't really know it. I mean, the student of Stockhausen that I love musically is Gottfried Michael Koenig. Those electronic pieces, those computer pieces, like all the function pieces, are just that is some weird music.
So, so then I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
and that's duly noted, but I wanted to ask you also about Xenakis.
Oh yeah, okay. So Xenakis is huge for me. Yeah, I was crazy about Xenakis. Um, and I mean, I love the through the whole output, the whole body of work. I mean, and conceptually, it's just really like, yeah, amazing. Um, I studied a lot of Xenakis's music. You
Tell
know,
me which ones.
well, you know, I worked a lot on some of the early stuff. Like I remember having to do for like maybe like oral exams or something, a big long analysis of Pitheprocta. I went
Oh,
through and tried to like just work through that stuff and understand it formally. And I remember being, you know, he's important. The electronic music is important, especially in its relationship to Schaeffer and his time at the studio in Paris. But even the later electronic music, I really really love. I mean, I had an incredible kind of world shaking experience of hearing La Legendaire in 8 channels at Stanford University when I was a grad student, and that piece is just unbelievably brilliant and amazing. And to
Can you
hear it in 8,
explain?
yeah, it was so it was just like it was a kind of, you know, conversion experience or something when you hear that thing, like because it starts, you know, that's a piece that starts off with this like super high sine tones, like at the highest part of the register, right? And then and he's working with these gestures, and then as you hear the kind of difference tones come in, it was like there's this kind of transformation where it goes from that to being like bird song, like 3 minutes into it or 4 minutes into it or something. And then I don't know, you know, he's the I love I what I like about Xenakis, you know, to put it just in the kind of bluntest terms, is like that music is kind of is raw and intense, and it works at a kind of temporal scale that is sort of I you know, I don't know, how would I put it, indifferent to the human. It doesn't really work on human time scales, you know. It's like, so he'll do things where I used to think this contrast, and I don't know, maybe I would think this now, but I remember like years ago, I'd be like, all right, you know, if you listen, like, as much as I would love like um Ligity's music, I'd always feel like it's actually really well crafted and kind of like proportional. It's kind of like, you know, Metamorphoses or any of those pieces, like they hang out in these sound worlds as long as they're supposed to, and then they go to the next thing. And Xenakis will like hang out in the sound world as long as it's supposed to, and then he will like break for silence for a second and then continue that sound world. Like he doesn't make concessions to kind of like your typical kind of aesthetic judgments. He will always push on to the, or force the listener to kind of grapple with something that is a little bit beyond their comprehension, that will challenge their own sense of what the proportion should be. And I love that aspect of his music, because something happens right as soon as you kind of hit that threshold of like as soon as you kind of hit the threshold that might be boredom or feeling like exhausted with some particular kind of sound world, as soon as you stick with it, it just begins to transform. Yeah, as a listener, right? I mean, the sounds transform. Your relationship to it changes. You have to find new things to listen to. New aspects come to the fore. So I mean, I love kind of music that works on those time scales. Messiaen's music does that for me. Feldman's music does that for me. Xenakis does it for me. But Xenakis has also a kind of like intensity, a kind of, I guess, to essentialize in some sense. He's got that kind of Greek Dionysian wildness and intensity.
I agree. I think there's a wildness and a violence.
Mhm.
I sat in the round with my son for Safa.
Mm.
Or is that the sextet?
Yeah.
And it was concussive. We were too close to one guy.
Yeah.
So they were hitting the wood ball mallets on bass drums. So it's no joke. I mean, there's a brutality to it that, of course, bridged the gap to rock music for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think he has the followers that understood that if you're going to listen to brutality, I mean, that's as brutal as any metal.
Mm-hmm.
Heavy music in my books.
Yeah.
But yeah, that percussion stuff and just the three-dimensionality of his electronic music and just his sound world always. And then the attachment to mythology and the attachment to his culture.
Mm-hmm.
He's some sort of like, for me, almost like I'm an Armenian, so he's like a kind of model to how I try to view the Armenian experience in the context of my work.
Yeah. He's such an interesting figure in the kind of French electronic music world, I mean, partially as a immigrating right to France, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
spending so much time there, right, after World War II. But he was always, kind of I mean, I guess I study this stuff because I'm interested in like the whole French electronic music world, partially as an academic and partially musically. But the so while while Boulezz's kind of institution got all the money and became the kind of place that was training all these composers, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, where that Schaeffer had started, was always sort of attached to French. It was always a little wing within French radio. It was always sort of a smaller studio in relationship to IRCAM, even though that's where it all started. And then Xenakis was like never got any funding. He was like all of his stuff was sort of off.
What was this place called again?
Oh, I forget.
Lupique.
Yeah. Well, he had that. Yeah, I don't know. I'm 10 years ago. I would have been. I would have known all the names.
He had a musical drawing board, right? That responded to information.
Yeah, but he kind of like was never sort of like given the kind of that legitimate kind of like governmental stamp on the arts that they do in Europe sometimes. So in some ways, his own electronic music, I think, is a little bit more kind of homemade. It's a little bit less it can be less. It can be more specific because it doesn't have to deal with the generality of being a studio for many. And in some sense, I think that one of his models, or one of the people that he might follow in the footsteps of, would be Pierre Henry, not so much Pierre Schaeffer, right? Because Pierre Henry eventually, leaves the Groupe de Recherche Musicale in the early 60s, right, or late 50s, and then he's got his own studio, and he's just cranking stuff out for the rest of his life out of his house, basically. His whole house becomes this kind of like amazing sound studio, where every object's been touched and percussed and recorded. And so I think Xenakis has some of that. There's a kind of cool there's a little bit of a kind of do-it-yourself thing in his electronic music, right?
Who might have come up with the concept of recording the sound of coal burning?
Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant, but he's also trying to work with he's trying to think about he's trying to do granular synthesis before you could do granular synthesis. And that's what concrete pH is, and that's what so much of the kind of cloud-based, stochastic music is about. He's very. I heard somebody once tell me that Xenakis would always talk music to the mathematicians and always talk math to the musicians. Like like, you know, I don't know if he didn't want to be pinned down, and a lot of, and I've heard people make critiques of formalized music saying, oh, you know, he spends all this time like giving these proofs at the end of the book, but these are proofs that any mathematician would already know. What, like, it's kind of like there's something performative about it. And I don't know, you know, that's probably true. There is probably a kind of positional thing that he's trying to do to, you know, to kind of carve out a niche for himself. But I feel like his music is very aware of it, it's trying to work on a kind of macro level of perception. You know, he's you know, read Gabor, and he's read, you know, Meyer Epler, and he's aware of all that stuff, and Hermann Scherchen, and he's aware of all the stuff that's going on in Europe, all the research into electroacoustics and psychoacoustics as it's shaping up. But he's really interested in kind of making a music that sits between, that is functioning above the level of the detail and below the level of the whole. You know, it's always this kind of macro world where, you know, tons of sounds kind of form a kind of gestalt or come together and make a shape that can be manipulated. And so, I mean, to me, like the mathematics always seem to be being used to that end, is a kind of way of modeling large phenomena, you know, a kind of system that he could make that would allow him to compose without having to worry about every single detail. Like he didn't have to labor over the difference between A and A flat,
Yeah.
you know, because the mathematics would allow him to kind of generate 100 notes all at once, right, and plop them into place. But he's very, very concerned with that next level of perception, where something about these big sound masses is moving, you know, they're moving along and being shaped, and I think, you know, that's that thinking about music in those terms is congruent with, you know, you hear work like that happening in improvised music too, you know, where, so I think that's one of the reasons
Now,
why
this is a good point, because I wanted to talk about that, and that was a particular interest to me in bridging the gap between that world and the improvised music world and the free jazz world,
yeah, yeah,
because there's no reason that they wouldn't be related.
mm-hmm.
You know, and also if you're the person that's interested in those things and you see a connection there, and I know you're a connections guy, it's like you see the connection, the line through, and say, well, how are these things different?
Right,
Everyone's trying for the same type of thing. And it's funny, Andy Partridge says, and shout out to Andy, it's when you're imitating something that you're trying to replicate and you get it wrong.
mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah,
what that's what you're doing. It
yeah,
becomes a sort of a culture. It becomes its own, like Tomorrow Never Knows becomes its own culture,
yeah,
and affects Genesis and affects Yes and everybody.
mm-hmm.
But Xenakis, there's also, to me, there's always a fuck you element to Xenakis. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm gonna go as far as I want with this. You're welcome or not.
Yeah, yeah,
And I love that. Kronerg, you know,
yeah,
taking, you know, upwards of an hour, and just, you have to deal with it. And then even the fact that this is an interesting juncture, and I know you've heard this. There's a recording on YouTube, folks, if you don't know this, of the premiere in Paris of Varese Désert,
mm-hmm.
recorded by Xenakis in Pierre Schaeffer's studio, right? Remotely.
Yeah, yeah,
And you can hear the people booing, etc. And it's the first Varese live playing and electronic recording piece, as you all know. And so it's very much an important moment where you have Xenakis is witnessing the reaction to this in real time.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I
they
mean,
didn't care. They did not care for the Varese.
yeah. I mean, there's a modernism, you know. I mean, Xenakis is a modernist he's a hardcore old school modernist. I love that about him. I mean, I kind of can dig music that says "fuck you," or is written in such a way that it doesn't accommodate itself to, that it's not easily, it doesn't accommodate itself to the kind of norms, and is not easily assimilated. I love music that that forces me to learn how to hear it. You know what I mean? Or a music that is like teaching me how to hear it as it's happening, unfolding.
And intent. It has a very clear intent that we must become aware of.
Yeah.
And I think that for formation, uh, begins, you know, kind of a summation, I think, of principles. Like what's going on here? I think I try to learn to listen that way.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what are they telling me?
Yeah, I'm always like, if there's music that I hear that I'm just like, I don't know how to listen to this yet, then that's the stuff I want to keep hearing. Yeah, that's like that's interesting. That happens less and less. I feel like as I've gotten older, it's rare. I don't know if I just heard more stuff or I'm less curious or something, but
Mm.
but I love music that I'm just like, I do not know how to hear this yet.
Yeah, I know. What do you think that is? That's so interesting to me because I always tell people I like not knowing what's going on.
Yeah,
What is that? It's
yeah,
just I'm curious. I don't know. It's a exciting feeling of a little bit of fear, a little bit of, you know, this is my problem, a little bit of it's just striking you.
hmm,
So it's making you want to know more.
yeah,
Yeah, that's an important uh, distinction, I think. So electronic music can afford you that perhaps more readily than instrumental music, but you see instrumental music and instrumentalists being so affected by electronic music.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I also think about electronic music. Well, I mean, we haven't talked at all about Schaeffer, but I tend to think about electronic music. Well, oh, all right. So we'll talk about Schaeffer, and then I think there's a bigger point to make about electronic music in some sense.
Please.
So Schaeffer is. I love all that early music hall crowd. I think it's really interesting music. I don't think that Schaeffer himself is the best composer. I think about him as a kind of theorist, right, and a kind of researcher. Um,
That's fair.
you're right. I mean, Pierre Henry for me is the kind of poet of music concrète in that early moment. I think all of that early Pierre Henry work is just mind blowing. Incredible.
Agreed.
Um, uh, but that a lot of there was I really love the theorizing that Schaeffer was doing in the starting in the early 50s. With a book like In Search of a Concrete Music, and then later on the Treatise on Musical Objects, was a huge text for me. I mean, in my own work, my academic work, um, I feel like I try to give a very generous and patient reading of Schaeffer, while I'm also critical of it. I think there are problems with the way in which he goes about it, theorizes the work he's doing. But for me, Schaeffer is one of the greatest theorists of sound that we have in the 20th century.
Yeah.
He is intensely interested in how we know sound, what an instrument is, what is the ontology of sound. He's trying to come up with classification strategies. Could you make a kind of conceptual map of all possible sounds? He's actually working on projects like this, like crazy projects, right? So I feel there's things about him that are really interesting. I think there's also biographical stuff about him that's interesting. Coming out of like coming kind of out of a certain kind of spiritual French Catholic tradition, and then working in the radiophonic world.
Not unlike Messan, by the way.
Yeah. Um, there's just lots of, I don't know, there's lots of interesting aspects about him biographically. I think he's a really complicated figure who we actually in some sense we don't really know yet. There's still a lot that's sort of unknown, and he had a very complicated relationship, I think, even with his own musical production. I sometimes wonder if he was a masochist in a certain way, as I do more research on him. One, always seems to take on the criticism of his own work and take it very kind of not personally, but sort of integrate it and accept it in ways that seem, too, I don't know. He's a complicated and interesting figure. But that stuff was always really important for me. Musically, I just really loved it. I love sample based work. I think is really interesting. I think the way that those guys manipulate samples and the way that they are shaping and dealing with their materials is fascinating. But the thing about electronic music is that I think about electronic music as really being not tied specifically to the avant-garde, but that there's a kind of art music world of electronic music that's coming out in the 50s. Let's say this would be Schaeffer and some of the early Stockhausen work and other studios that are developing. But there's also popular electronic music. And popular electronic music for me is like the Forbidden Planet soundtrack,
Okay.
Les Paul and Mary Ford,
Legend of Hell House. Do you know that one?
No, 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 no. I don't
British
know that.
electronic composer. I can't remember the name, but please put it in the comments.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's all electronic score for a horror film, and it's terrifying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for all the work that I mean, the avant-garde did amazing work with electronics, but people know electronics through the popular electronic music world, right?
it's so true. That's
Right.
really
That's
interesting.
where that whole sound world comes from. And I think that, so somebody to me, so I think about, I want to try to live in a world where I think about electronic music not as being carved up between the popular and the avant-garde, but actually as linking together somebody like Pierre Schaeffer and Les Paul. That there's a kind of sound world that's happening, a post-war sound world that of both popular music and the avant-garde, that is intensely interested in the possibilities of sound recording and what it's going to bring. And one of the experiences that I think, any composer or musician, who essentially is born, you know, or it comes to their musical maturity after World War II. This would be the generation of Stockhausen, Ligeti, Xenakis, Boulez, and also the generation of, you know, Buddy Holly and others, in America too. They all have the opportunity to deal with electronic music in some sense with the studio. They're shaped by that. Stockhausen's music, Xenakis's music, Ligeti's music is radically shaped by an experience of the studio. They can work
Hmm.
with sound masses. They can have continuous sounds that don't have attacks or decays at the end. It radically changes the way in which they think about how to orchestrate and how to compose. I think in the popular music side, the possibilities of the studio just radically shape and change how one can start to conceptualize popular music. Les Paul's one of the first ones who starts to do it, imagining these sound worlds that are built on like the repertory of Paul Whiteman, but sound like some crazy futuristic stuff, right? So they're both they're out of time in this interesting way. They're both futuristic and modern sounding while they're also nostalgic. The repertoire
Yeah,
is
that
also,
is true. Yeah.
and it takes a while, I think, in the pop music world, but Tomorrow Never Knows is a piece of sonic architecture, right? That's shaped up in a specific way that can only happen in the studio. The Beatles are like, they have that experience of working in the studio, and it radically transforms their music. So to me, I think that the what's really interesting about electronic music is are the affordances that it offers musicians and composers to kind of radically shape their sound worlds in ways that were just not available before those tools. It's not like, for me, it's not a story of like, I would never write a book like how, whatever, and then subtitle how electronic music changed everything. Like I kind of, there's books like this, like, how sound recording changed everything. And I kind of hate the how whatever changed everything titles. But I think there's just this really complicated set of interactions between musical conventions, prior musical practices, technological possibilities that are just in this complex mix and matrix in the 50s, and that's just so much of the birth of our contemporary soundscape. So I'm really interested, I guess, in kind of early electronic music. I mean, I've written about Les Paul and I've written about Pierre Schaeffer. I write about him in the same book intentionally. To me, that's the kind of moment, that's the historical moment where all of this new sound world emerges. And so I'm interested in that. There's a kind of academic and historical side of my work that's interested in kind of plumbing the beginnings of that. That's why the 50s actually have become more and more important to me. I want to know kind of like, I want to be able to kind of trace and understand and see what's happening at that moment. And so it's taken me to like weird places, like I've spent a lot more time listening to like a lot of 50s music, a lot of the kind of pre-rock and roll 50s music that's being shaped in the studio, but that I was never that excited about, the Frankie Lane's Mule Train and stuff like that, where the stereophonic effects are really kind of amazing, and the space that the atmosphere they get on that recording is
What about
incredible.
I Only Have Eyes for You production?
Oh, I love that, it's incredible, right? But
Right.
those are things like that is, to me, that's why everything we hear on the radio, everything we listen to is electronic music, because it's all shaped through that studio process. It's all being sculpted in the studio. It's all being worked on. So the kinds of, in some sense, I hear, I don't know. I mean, a record that I really like nowadays, I think is amazingly well sonically sculpted, is Dua Lipa's new record. I think Future Nostalgia is like you know, actually like the production on it is incredible. But I hear in it, uh, I could I can hear in it historically the kinds of finicky, tight tape manipulations and editing that one would have gotten in the musique concrète world. As long, also I can hear in it the kind of both the future and nostalgia that one hears in Les Paul's music. You know, like I can hear in that music all of these longer historical.
Who's producing this?
You know, I don't know. I should know who produced it, but whoever did it did an amazing job, because that record is like every note is like just, you know, massaged and tweaked and changed. And it's, you know, I mean, this is like a huge record, right? A huge pop record. She's like, you know, it's not anything musically. I think it's good, and I like her singing and stuff. But there's something about the way that record is put together, the sound of it and its production that is just really incredible. And so it's a record that I ended up sort of teaching a lot when I do like a music appreciation course. Just recently I taught one, and I ended up talking a lot about that record because I can in it I can it has deep roots, I think, and I can excavate those roots for the students. You know, I can tell a story about how we got from the arrival of magnetic tape in America in the 1950s, you know, or even the you know, the arrival of magnetic tape period to that record. You know, there's a narrative, there's a not a direct line, but a really complicated narrative to tell about that.
Do you find interest in pre-tape media for recording?
Yeah, I'm nuts about it, actually.
Yeah. I thought you might be.
Yeah. So I've actually, this is a new thing I've been working on lately. I've how do I talk about this? I'm kind of into old home recordings. I've been kind of buying up old home recordings, like instantaneous discs. You know about these, right? So these would be like, I guess for the audience, right? These are like, you know, in the 1940s, you had these like record cutters, right? You had basically a home, like a machine you could buy, big suitcase.
Like a photo booth. And also that was a public version of it, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Then you could get these like big suitcase sized record players, usually with a radio inside. And you could cut your own records on them, right? You'd buy an acetate, and so these are called instantaneous recordings. And like folks like John Lomax and Alan Lomax, you know, relied on these in the 1930s and 40s when they were doing folk song collecting. And so, for instance, like the Jelly Roll Morton interviews that Alan Lomax did are all done on Presto instantaneous discs. And so those are really interesting. And the home recordings, you know, so people just like had these machines, you know, I mean, they were kind of like, you know, they were available, they're expensive, but you could buy one. But radios were expensive back then too. Right. And you could record stuff. So I have a bunch of those that are actually really interesting to listen to. And I love wire recordings. I have a whole ton of wire recordings as well. So those are done on magnetic wire, spools of magnetic wire. You can get about an hour of recording time on them on a full spool. The sound quality is actually pretty good on magnetic wire. The bandwidth is not great, but the surface noise is really low. So they're actually like, and they don't deteriorate. So unlike tape, you know, like nowadays where sometimes you try to play back an old tape and it starts disintegrating in the machine. The wires are pretty stable and they sound good. And so I've done actually a lot of digitizing of those recently. This summer I've been doing that, and I just gave a talk on home recording. So I'm very much interested in the pre-tape recording world. I mean, partially because I think the recordings are just interesting and weird. Like, it's weird to hear what people wanted to record in 1952, right? The kind of stuff that they thought was interesting. And it's interesting to think about the ways in which the machine is also soliciting certain kinds of recordings. So there's a lot of like making kids perform, you know, like making them sing. I have a lot of recordings of people singing Home on the Range. That seemed to be the song and how much is that doggy in the window? There's a lot of that. People imitating.
And these are cultural captures. You know, sort of like what would have penetrated to the level of that repeats across the board.
Yeah. And so in some sense, I guess these are like old photo albums. You know, you could think about them in that sense. They kind of capture that. But there's also something about sound that is kind of mysterious and doesn't quite give you as much information, or gives you different kind of information than photographs. So you could never like take a bunch of wire recordings and try to do something like get a history of decor, or do a project where you were like getting, you know, old home films from a particular neighborhood to kind of reconstruct its, you know, geography and those kinds of things. What you end up being able to reconstruct I think, through sound, in some ways, are the social relations that are being shaped up in real time between people. So you can look at a family photo where here's like, mom and dad and the kids, like some Leave It to Beaver style 1950s photo. But it's another thing to hear that family soliciting their kids to try to sing in front of this machine, and to hear the way they're cajoling them, and to hear like, all this social stuff that is actually like, that's what's really going on, in the family. So there's things like that I love about old recordings.
Where do you find them?
eBay.
eBay.
Yeah, I mean, my collection is not like, it's not systematic. I'll sometimes go on eBay. I'll be like, oh, somebody's selling 10 wires, and I'll just buy about 10 wires. I mean, I have an old wire. I got one right here.
Give us, the audience, what the years for wires would be.
So wires had a short lifespan. Wires would be, I think they came into kind of mass production in the mid 40s. Webster Chicago made, and Sears Silvertone were the companies that really made a lot of these wire machines. Mid 40s, and then by the mid 50s they're out because reel-to-reel tape is starting to come in. So it's usually the wires are from late 40s, early 50s. Instantaneous recordings have a longer lifespan. You can find early stuff from the late 30s, and a lot of it is 40s. And so yeah, usually those records tend to be more 1940s, and the wires.
And wax cylinder.
Wax cylinder, that's 1900, 1910. That's the early stuff. But wax cylinders kind of stick around for a while. I mean, one of the things that I like about early sound media is that it doesn't fit into a kind of standard narrative about how sound media typically works. So the standard narrative, right, would be, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is overly academic, but the standard narrative that we often get about sound media nowadays is something like, sound media always begins as like military technology, and then it goes into the industrial realm, and then it eventually becomes a consumer product. So this would be, so magnetic tape, for instance, is like a perfect example of this, right? Invented, by the Germans, during World War II as a kind of, developed as a military technology to help make deceptive sound recordings, and to, and to transport, the voice of the Fuhrer all over Europe. And then there's an American soldier that, brings these things back to America. Ampex and the industry, start to use it. It happens in Columbia, in the studios, and then eventually, it becomes a consumer technology. And so there's a very kind of standard narrative you can tell about magnetic tape, and everybody knows magnetic tape because, eventually the cassette players came out, and then everybody started recording stuff in the, 1980s and making mixed tapes. And then you've got this whole huge cultural imagination that's attached to it. But if you go before magnetic tape, instantaneous discs come and go. Wire recording was actually invented early on, like by a guy named Vladimir Poulsen, like in the early 1900s. It was used.
Does it really exist that early?
Yeah, I mean, now the problem is that he didn't have tubes to do amplification with, right? But there was that they understood you could magnetize wire and record sound on it, so he used it as an answering machine kind of technology for the telephone. So it's early on, it's that, and then it comes back in the 1940s. So there's these kind of weird gaps and jumps in the earlier sound technology world. There's these dead ends. There's also the problem of now trying to, keep the machines going to be able to hear this archive, right? I mean, if you want to listen to a wire, you need a wire, you need a machine to play it on. And those are not easy. I mean, you can get them on eBay. They're all dead. They need to be restored. They're all tube based. And, there's like.
Would wire have been played over the radio?
So yeah, sometimes on the radio. So sometimes you would play a wire over the radio. Wires were also, I mean, an example would be Tony Schwartz, the kind of great, I think of him as the kind of, he was on New York radio for years and years, right? He was like the kind of recording the sounds of New York guy. And he'd put out a bunch of records like on Folkways in the 50s, and he had a radio show, but he used wire recordings early on. He would travel around New York with a kind of portable battery operated wire recorder, and he could record sounds on the street, and then he would bring them back to the studio. So he used that. And he really loved, say, like the portability and the of wire, and the fact that you could send a spool in the mail. So he had people, he was corresponding with people all over the world, and people were sending in spools, and, here's a song from Arkansas, here's a song from South Africa, here's, like that kind of stuff. So he would use it. A lot of radio work at that time would be done on, they had, radio also had these big 16-inch um, 16-inch records that they would use, these things that they sometimes call electrical transcriptions. They ran at 33 and a third. That's where that speed kind of comes from. And those were fairly high quality sounding records, about 15 minutes per side. So you get half an hour on them and you can flip them over. And a lot of radio was done with that. But it depends, radio was, a live medium for the most part up until World War II. I mean, there were some syndicated transcribed shows, but mostly it was a live medium, and the networks did not like playing phonograph records on the radio. Like, we think of the radio now as just like all you do is play phonographs on them, right? But the 1940s were not necessarily like that. So there was recorded stuff, especially on local stations. And I don't know, this is a whole complicated radio history kind of topic, but so wire was sometimes used on the radio, but you more often than not, if you had recorded stuff, it would be on what they call an electrical transcription, which is a big 16-inch 33 and a third disc. And those are great too. I have a bunch of those, and I have a machine that can play them. What's that?
Made out of?
A lot of them would have acetate usually on the outside. The core would be sometimes cardboard, which doesn't last very well, sometimes metal. They usually then have acetate on the outside. The acetate can flake. Some of them were made of vinyl later on. They're great objects. A lot of them were, sometimes you could record right off the air onto one of these discs. So one of the reasons why we have a radio archive at all is because of these discs. I mean, if people thought about radio as a live medium, it's, in some sense, we shouldn't have a radio archive. It's not like everybody recorded everything for posterity, because this was just being cranked out, all the time. So, and they used to, I don't know, those discs were used to, the Benny Goodman Carnegie Hall recording was done on those kinds of discs, as far as I know, so I don't know what I guess one of the things I love about the early sound recording stuff is I'm kind of interested in recording without the recording industry or something, like thinking about recording not as the story of like consumer music being put in the form of a commodity and being sold to everybody and being consumed, but the idea of what is it like to be a recordist? What would you record?
And you've covered that with this kind of research, with this kind of evidence that clearly exists. It's fascinating because you're right. It's not at all the way you would think of commercial recording. It's documentation,
right?
It's cultural demarcation. It's really it's a picture, like you say, a picture in time.
Yeah, I love thinking about, I mean, so I like thinking about sound media and about media in general, sort of forcing myself to think about the fringes of media. Not because the mainstream stuff is not interesting, it's super interesting, but it's also been really well trod, right? So I mean, I'm never going to write a book about the phonograph industry because there's a million books on it that are great, and I'm never going to write a book about golden age radio because there's a million books about it that talk about everything. But I like that. But the fringe stuff I think is interesting, because to think about the fringes, you need the mainstream. So you can't think about like fringe radio without thinking about the mainstream, and you can't think about home recording without thinking about the record business. But there's all this weird stuff that's happening in the margins and the edges, and I think that and those places, the margins and the edges, can be useful for then reflecting back on what the mainstream is, the norms that the mainstream kind of enforced, but also imagining in a kind of utopian sense, what else could these media have been, right? So what would it be like if radio had continued to be a live medium and not a medium of like a phonographic reproduction? I mean, our sound worlds of the 1950s and 60s and onward would be radically different, but what if it just continued to be a live medium? Like, that would be our whole soundscape would be so radically different, because we couldn't be talking about Tomorrow Never Knows or sound recordings that we all know every second of because we've heard them on classic rock radio a million times. It would just be a totally different kind of sonic world. So I think there's something useful about just kind of the counterfactual possibilities of fringe media, let's say, So I don't know. This is, I mean, in some ways I'm still working through a lot of this stuff because this is a kind of newer project for me. You know, it takes me out of the electronic music world, takes me out of the jazz world, and is thinking it's more media studies and media theoretic. But I like it. It's fun to work on. And it and one of the places where it ends up linking up with the electronic music world is this. I think that the roots. So I do believe, right, that like, you know, electronic music has this kind of popular and this avant-garde dimension to it, and in some sense it's, you know, it radically changes our whole soundscape post-war. I think one of the interesting things about that is the practitioners who are involved in making recordings, making electronic music, working in the studio, almost none of them are like trained electrical engineers, right? Les Paul learns his craft, you know, from reading radio books and hanging out, like, you know, in his cousin's radio repair shop or whatever, you know. When David Tudor is making electronic music, you know, he's reading, you know, Radio Shack books and other, you know, that kind of stuff. There's so much, you know, in America, we never really had a kind of institutional studio, electronic music studio, right, system.
Yeah, you can see that in synthesis. Synthesis is just guys working in their garages.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in Paris, there's the studio of French radio, right? In Germany, it's in Cologne, it's connected to radio. In Paris, it's the Milan studio, right? There's ones in, you know, in Scandinavia, they got these institutions.
What did you think of the stuff coming out of the Columbia Princeton?
Well, I mean, I love that stuff. There's so much of it that I like. I mean, that's probably the closest we get to a kind of institutional studio. I mean, the Babbitt recordings are great, you know, in certain, I mean, they're interesting. Usashevsky, I think, is quite an interesting composer.
Davidovsky?
Davidovsky, yeah, those are great pieces. You know, there's great stuff that comes out of there. I'm fond of that place because I was at Columbia for a couple of years and I got to like hang out in that building and see the RCA synthesizer and all that stuff. It's great. I don't think that like it has a signature sound. Maybe Babbitt stuff, maybe Babbitt's work with the big RCA synthesizer has a kind of signature sound. It doesn't have as much of a signature sound as, say, Paris did, or the Cologne studio, or even the Japanese studio. But what I think, when these, you know, but like Cage, for instance, never like was associated with a particular studio, right? He'd go to, sometimes he'd be in Indiana or Illinois or what, you know, like he'd move around from place to place for projects. But so much of that stuff is basically do it yourself, right? These people are self-educated, they're making their own circuits, they're working on that. So, and that all comes out of the radio amateur tradition, you know, which goes way back to the 1920s. So, and the whole radio amateur thing is really about thinking about radio as a transmission medium, not a reception medium, right? I mean, we think about radio, I think, mostly in terms of reception, so to speak. Like it's about the big cultural imaginary that's shaped by radio, you know, like we all have a shared soundscape. We all know what the genres are, you know, so when we think about radio, we think about its market impact and its cultural impact. And, you know, how did it unify the country during World War II and those kinds of questions. But if you think about it from the side of making radio, transmitting, right, then you start to get this whole kind of do-it-yourself side where people are just like experimenting and being weird. And so for me, the roots of a lot of electronic music are actually built into these kind of informal practices and pedagogies around do-it-yourself electronics, right?
I like it.
You know, so that for me is really interesting, thinking about that there may be that in some sense, you know, well, how do we put it? I've kind of buried the lead, but I guess the lead would be something like, you know, maybe Les Paul and David Tudor kind of got the same education in electronic music.
I would say there's a fair bet.
Right. And that might be interesting to explore as to what that looks like. You know, why is that the case? And what did those kinds of informal pedagogies and, you know, conversations, how did that shape the kind of experimental project? I mean, there might be some story to tell about do-it-yourself electronics from, you know, from the radio ham to circuit bending or something, you know, that's partially a technical story, partially a cultural story, you know, and partially a kind of story about what we would have many dimensions, you know. You know, you could think about it in terms, I mean, you could think about the question of why is it the kind of circuit bending and the kind of, you know, why is that community so heavy with dudes, you know, right? It's a very dude heavy world. There's historical kind of reasons for that, I think. I mean, Susan Douglas has kind of talked a little bit about this in her radio work, where she talks about the ham radio ham culture was set up as a kind of form of alternative masculinity in the 1910s, you know? So if you weren't a Rooseveltian Rough Rider, you could be an Edisonian inventor, right? That was a way of kind of being a dude in the 1910s, you know? So there's these kinds of norms about, say, masculinity, about gender. There's also questions about ethnicity that are hooked into this. So a lot of folks who are working in radio and learning about this stuff, you know, maybe folks that are kind of ethnically marked as kind of non-white in early America. You know, they're immigrants, like, you know, Les Paul is Lester Polfus. I know a guy named Del Kasher who's really interesting, whose folks are Hungarian, you know,
Oh,
and
they're
like,
bringing over a kind of like Tesla European and intellectual and investigating kind of thing.
but they're also finding, I think, a space kind of within the world of like electronics that seems to me kind of like ethnically unmarked, you know, in a kind of you know, perhaps in a way that's probably a kind of fantasy that they're living out, but it's a kind of way of like, you don't need to, like, your difference is hidden in some sense. You can just kind of like be in the sounds and in the circuits and stuff.
Wow.
And so I think that's kind of interesting too. There might be, so I think there are many dimensions to thinking about these histories of media. They lead us, you know, not just, they don't just tell us about, you know, sonic histories. They tell us about cultural histories and personal histories and broader kinds of ways of that we conceptualize ourselves. But this for me is one of the great joys of studying sound, is that sound is always overdetermined. It's always bleeding out in a million different directions. It always can be, there's always more to interpret. It's infinitely aspectual. It is conceptually dense. You know, it's just aspects all the way down.
See, it's interesting because I did want to speak with you a little bit about guitarist Derek Bailey today, and I wonder what your take on his approach to the sound world was, because I always felt that he was very interested in density and very interested in chunks of sound and a kind of treating the instrument as a sound generator, nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah.
And I wonder as a guitarist what you made of him.
I mean, I'm in awe of Derek Bailey as a musician. I mean, uh, I love his playing, um, and I'm always just so struck by the utter. I mean, it's utterly original. It's utterly recognizable, right? There's nobody that sounds like him, and I was always amazed that he was able to sort of that he figured out a way to work against the challenges of the guitar. I mean, for me, like the guitar is really. I mean, I played guitar. I guess the audience should know, right? I mean, I was a jazz guitarist for a long time before I like became a full time academic. Guitar's a really pretty instrument, you know, without all the electronics added to it, right? Without distortion and all that stuff. It's a kind of a pretty instrument. I think it's hard to kind of make it nasty in certain ways, and it's you know, it's easy on the piano. You can always grab. There's always a note next to the note. There's always the semitone that you can just grab, and there's all this, you know, guitar is like so pretty, and I always had to fight against that in certain ways. And I think there are different ways to do it. I mean, one way is to turn it into an electronic instrument, you know, electrify it and manipulate its sound, and that's great. You know, that's Jimi Hendrix and that's Bill Frisell and all that stuff, and it's incredible. Um, and Derek Bailey's way is just a totally different way to do it. I mean, it's like, even though he's got the volume pedals going, it's not heavily manipulated through electronics. It's just a kind of intense reconceptualization of that instrument as a sort of as a percussive harmonic making stringed thing, you know. It's just remarkable. I mean, Fred Frith is also somebody who I think kind of really reimagines the instrument in all kinds of ways, partially working with it electronically, thinking about what the, you know, about its physicality, like what kind of thing it is that's resonating. It's how to work with the pickups and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. But Derek Bailey, I think, it just kind of totally reimagined the guitar as not this kind of pluck, you know, this beautiful harp-like instrument, but a kind of orchestra of harmonics and pluck sounds and swells, and you know. So I'm just kind of in awe of the way in which he works so hard against the norms of the instrument to produce something that is so beautifully, that's still, you know, what's the word I'm looking for, guitar-ish in some ways, you know, but is it's for me it's just like an alternative universe of the guitar. What if we, you know, like that could be, the guitar could have been that in some sense,
Right.
right? You know? Yeah.
What if you didn't do that other stuff and there's this kind of stuff? Could that keep you busy for 50 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With him, it obviously could, you know, there was just endless amounts of stuff to explore.
Solo guitar, solo acoustic guitar.
Uh-huh.
I can tell you the volume pedal thing was masterful. Um, the availability of all the harmonics on the neck and which ones he'd want to scooch a little bit with the volume pedal was ridiculous.
Yeah.
You couldn't see anybody, and he had huge hands, so you couldn't find a finer guitarist to watch. But you also couldn't figure out how he was getting all this rapid fire harmonic stuff going, and how high stuff would appear to be on low strings. And it's just it's a remarkable outpouring for a guy who knew every position, every possible harmonic, every artificial harmonic, had control over feedback at low volumes.
Yeah.
Go figure that one.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I just think, you know, I think one of the first Derek Bailey records I heard would have been the duet records with Anthony Braxton, because I was just like crazy about Braxton when I was an undergrad. And I was just, I mean, at the time I was just thinking like, what other guitarist could do this? You know, like who else on that instrument could be so inside Braxton's playing and thinking at that moment? I mean, I think those duet records are incredible that they made. I just couldn't think of another guitarist who could do it at that time. I mean, maybe there were folks around, but to me, the fact that he was so one of a kind just meant that he had just absolutely reconceptualized that instrument. It sounded like the guitar. It was still the guitar, and yet it was, you know, there was nobody in the world that played guitar like that. So I mean, I don't know. That just blows me away. You know.
I agree. And when we remastered Banter from '96, I don't remember, mid '90s, and it's on YouTube if you want to hear me and Derek Bailey playing together. When we remastered it, the guy who was remastering it, I knew he had the ear for percussion, and I knew he had the ear for the overall making it a brighter, better recording.
Yeah.
But I had to explain to him, don't think of this as a guitar. I did. I had to have that conversation. Like this is not about you making this a guitar thing. This is about, let's capture those sounds, whatever they are. And sometimes like he would have huge jumps in volume. Like that's the other thing. He's so dynamic. And then he'd be down here.
Yeah.
And so it also, he would say things to me like, and you'll appreciate this, don't listen to me when you play.
Right. Yeah.
And he wouldn't tune to my vibraphone.
Okay.
Because, quote, we don't want it to sound too much like Christmas bells.
That's great. I mean, I love I mean, I think his book Improvisation is brilliant too, and I love that he was you know, incredibly articulate about improvisation and about what he's doing. I mean, to me, I love that. I love, you know, words have always been an important part of music for me. I mean, there are lots of great musicians who don't write and don't talk about music all that much, or maybe they talk about it but they don't write about it, and that's great. I mean, that's fine. For me, it was always really important when I was studying composition. I always felt it was really important to be able to write about the music and write about one's aesthetics. But that was just me personally, you know. And in some sense, I think it's because I've always been interested in trying to articulate what it is about music, or the music that I'm into, that I find captivating. You know, I want to be able to do more than point and grunt at the awesome bits. You know, sometimes we joke about this, like in academia, like when we're teaching music appreciation or something, music history, we're like, listen to that moment, like you just point and grunt, you know. but I want to be able to do more than that. I want to be able to kind of like talk about what's happening. So aesthetics has always been really important for me. Philosophy, trying to find ways of articulating, um, what's happening. I mean, music is this just kind of is, as I believe in its multi-aspectuality and it's just infinite density of meaning. And so words are a way of getting at that, trying to get at that, and also trying to talk about the way in which music and sound can be instantiations of people's listening, in the sense that it's impossible to know what other people are hearing, right? We don't have any kind of direct evidence of that, but music and language are ways of putting that on the record, of making those hearings kind of available. That's always been a kind of thing that I've been captivated by about music and sound. And so I love articulate musicians who can be brilliant players and brilliant writers, and Derek Bailey for me is both.
So true. Brian, what are you working on these days?
I'm finishing up a book on jazz. It's actually done, and I'm doing the editing and trying to get the permissions and all that stuff together. So for this will probably be out next year. And it's a book about jazz standards, basically. Not a kind of like, here are 20 great standards that you all should know, but thinking about, it's really a book thinking about what is a musical work, which is a question that's been thought about a lot, but thinking about it from the perspective of jazz. So rather than say like, oh, so how do I put it? Rather than begin answering that question by thinking about, Beethoven 5 or something like that, I begin the question by thinking about body and soul. What would it be like to think about musical works where something like Body and Soul was the main example? And one of the things I'm interested in standards is that they that musicians think about them as musical works, right? We talk about them like the musical works. They're entities, and we know what we're talking about, and yet they are always being transformed, always being changed. What constitutes that we don't always agree about what their their and structures are. So they are musical works that can change, right? And they change in relationship to communities of practice. So in some sense, when when Miles Davis plays But Not For Me, and instead of starting on the tonic chord, he begins on 5 of 5, and then every jazz musician does that same chord change afterwards. He's like rewritten that tune, become a different tune, and yet it's no problem, right? But
Right.
And so trying to think about, so that opens up a kind of world where jazz standards are a kind of form of sociality and musicians. So it's a place where performance contributes to the musical work. And so, I mean, some of this stuff has been thought before and written about before, but this book really tries to make a kind of coherent philosophical and historical argument about about what a musical work is, kind of thinking that question primarily through jazz. So I got a lot of resources for trying to do that. It's got a lot of, so I talk about a lot of tunes in it, and the first half of the book is all theoretical, trying to work through the philosophy and the ontology part of it, and the second half is mostly cultural and historical, trying to talk about why it is that standards kind of came into being and were important coin for jazz musicians to use, and how did that repertory come to be, and what role do they still play, if any, kind of in the jazz world. So it gets a little bit more historical and cultural in the second half.
What about Sonny Meets Hawk, Lover Man?
Yeah. It's amazing. Everyone should listen to it. I mean, I love these tunes they're incredible vehicles for improvisation. I mean, that's been like well noted, right? There's a certain view that's like, well, I should back up and say, like for your audience, that when I was working as a jazz musician and a guitarist, I mean, I was composing and I was interested in the avant-garde and I love free jazz and stuff, but like I was always a better kind of like bebop and guitarist, or like swing music guitarist. Even I played a lot of swing music because it was that time in San Francisco in the like 90s when like the whole swing thing was really big, and I loved that music. I loved like studying Charlie Christian and trying to like play in that style. And so that repertory has always been really important to me, and I'm old enough to have met a bunch of musicians in Oakland when I was really young, 19 years old, or just starting college, who cut their teeth in the 1950s and 1960s in Oakland. So I got those guys are all passed on now. But there were musicians who were really influential who were like, here's how you play this music, and here's what this community is about. And
Oakland scene was real, right?
oh, it was great. Yeah, yeah. And I used to, play in like this jam session band, on Telegraph Avenue, with with this old trumpet player who was kind of an institution out there. This guy Robert Porter passed away many years ago, but he played like mid 50s miles, like kind of like when lights are low, that kind of period. Um, and he was great. I learned a ton of music from him, and I got to kind of learn the spirit of the music from him. And then I worked with another guy named Frank Jackson, who was a singer and a piano player, really big like Nat Cole Trio guy, and he just knew every tune ever, and I learned all the repertoire from him. So that's kind of stuck with me. That kind of shaped my world early on, and I've always loved that music, even though there's never been a part of me that wants to say like, oh, the great. I never believed in like the greatness of the Great American Songbook. Right? To me, it was like, yeah, I don't care about its greatness. It's just it's a repertory that allowed for a lot of expressive practices to happen.
Yeah, it's like the Jarrett Trio.
Yeah,
You want to hear the Jarrett Trio, the way they play the piece
yeah,
is what the piece is.
yeah.
It's almost like a platform.
Yeah. So for me, like Embraceable You has never really been about like the greatness of Gershwin or something. But I also don't quite go as far as some folks are like, oh, jazz, man, it's all work, it's all play and no work, right? There's a great Aaron, there's a jazz philosophy article with that title. Andrew Kania wrote it, where he's basically saying, yeah, the work doesn't really matter so much. It's all about the improvisation that happens on it. And I think that's kind of true, but at the same time, there is a kind of coin. There's something that constrains improvisation too when you play these tunes. I mean, like, back in the day, like your livelihood might depend on actually knowing this repertoire, right? Like somebody's going to start playing something on the bandstand. They might not even call it out. And you got to know that stuff, right? So there's something on the line. And those tunes also have histories that are attached to them, right? So a song like Body and Soul, you can just trace out like the whole history of jazz in it. And there are performances, like there's a Joe Henderson performance, in the 90s or whatever, when he's playing with that pianist trio. I can't remember. Maybe it's on, I forget what record it's on. Maybe it was like, it might have been Rufus Reed and like Al Foster, those guys, on it. But where he basically just like, he just recapitulates the whole history of that tune in 12 minutes. Like he references Coltrane's version, he references Coleman Hawkins' version, he references the Chu Berry Roy Eldridge version. He he's just like working through all this stuff. And he's also just, Joe Henderson's brilliant, right? I mean, incredible improviser. And so it's just astonishing performance. And so again, it's a moment where like the music is, yeah, it's a vehicle for improvisation, but it's also just saturated with kind of history and culture and practice. And it's all being kind of put on display. And you got to do some work as a listener to kind of get to the point where you can hear all that stuff, or you need somebody to point it out to you. So so it's not that different from say thinking about electronic music or whatever. I've fairly kind of standard view about all this music for me is doing a certain kind of historical and cultural work. So in some sense, this book that that I've been working on for a long time is an attempt to sort of get that on the record, right? To say that that standards are important because they are malleable, they change over time, but they are also these repositories of practice. They have histories that are attached to them. They constrain musicians. They also are constrained by what musicians do. So it's really trying to kind of lay out that picture, both philosophically and culturally. That's what that project's about. It'll be, I hope, I mean, I don't know who's going to read it.
I'll read it.
I hope somebody reads it. But if not, it was like, I loved writing it. It was really fun to write and to work through and to kind of write about that music that I hadn't really written about before, even though jazz has always been a huge, I mean, jazz has been like, is the music I love most. Right. But I had never written about it. It was like a little bit of this academic thing where I'd written about a lot of music that I love, but jazz was a world that I like loved and inhabited. And I feel like it's really like, that's where everything kind of comes from and returns to, but I hadn't really explicitly spent time talking about that.
And what tunes did you cover?
I try to keep it kind of straightforward in a certain sense. Every chapter's got case studies in it. So some of the tunes, I talk a lot about Body and Soul. Body and Soul like shows up a lot in that book. I've got a bunch of stuff on, but not for me. And I've got stuff on Embraceable You. Because of Parker's recordings and of Ornette Coleman's version and other ones. I do a whole thing on the kind of relationship between So What, Impressions, Miles Davis's So What, John Coltrane's Impressions, right, which is the same tune with a different melody, and then and then a third tune called Why Not, that came out on a Rocky Boyd record with Pete LaRocca on the drums. That is also, how do I describe this? Lewis Porter's written about this. It's basically Impressions, right? But it's like kind of a different version. And then the melody from Impressions comes from this Morton Gould, from the Pavane, from the American Symphonette. And so I traced that stuff out. I mean, again, Lewis Porter had done a lot of the groundwork on this, but I try to draw some kind of other philosophical implications out of this. So there's a whole case study about that. Gosh, what else do I talk about? That's a lot of it. There's some stuff on Mood Indigo at the end, on Monk and Ellington on Mood Indigo. So I mean, I don't pick anything obscure. In some sense, I'm trying to keep it like right down the middle. But there's a lot of tunes that then, from those tunes, there's a lot of other stuff that gets pulled into the mix.
Fascinating stuff. This is really cool, Brian. I appreciate you talking about all of this.
Of course.
It's really fun to be able to bring so many different things together and try to see how they relate when so many people are trying to divide things up so strenuously.
Yeah.
You know, but thank you for talking today, and everyone, thank you for listening. This has been my colleague from Yale, Brian Kane. He's an interesting dude that's into some really cool music, and a pleasure to talk to. So I hope you've enjoyed listening. Brian, thank you.
Thank you. It's really fun to talk.
All right. See everybody next time on the ProgCast. Thanks for listening.